Hello, I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to the first of hopefully many reviews on Games as Lit 101. Now before I get started, I should specify, since all I've done before this are literary analyses, this is not the same as that. I may at one point or another go into Quantum Break in more depth, but this is just a review. I'll be talking about the game overall and talking about its quality and whether or not I would recommend it to you and for what reasons. That also means that there are not going to be any major spoilers in this review, just talking about the basic stuff you need to know about the game to gauge your interest and let you know what it's about. Coming up soon, I'm also going to be reviewing its companion novel, Quantum Break: Zero State, to talk a little bit about how adaptation from the game to the novel works, because adaptation is a really interesting subject and I haven't gotten to talk about it as much on this show as I would like to. So then, Quantum Break. Quantum Break is made by Remedy Entertainment, the creators of the two good Max Payne games and Alan Wake. They've always had something of a fascination with television. The Max Payne games had a few television shows that you could catch on TVs scattered throughout the game, and Alan Wake, also had this, but it was also structured as a television show. There were 5 episodes of it. Now, to be fair, that structure didn't really do anything for it. I mean, all it really did was break up what most games would just call chapters or episodes anyway into, episodes with their own credits at the end of them, and even a previously on Alan Wake segment at the beginning of each of them, despite the fact that you just played that stuff and didn't really need to see it. So, yeah, especially compared to something like the modern episodic setup like a Telltale or Life is Strange have done, it was a fun little experiment, but it didn't really add anything to the game. This time, though, they're trying to really combine the two. Quantum Break actually combines the game with a 4-episode live-action miniseries by essentially just sandwiching them in between each other and making it so that there are choices you make in the game that affect what you end up seeing in this live-action show. Now, for the sake of context, because I don't think I've talked about this much on this show yet, I certainly will at one point or another, there is nothing wrong with making games that are inspired by movies or filmic styles or anything like that. There was a while where cinematic became kind of a buzzword, right? We were trying to make video games look and feel like movies, and a lot of that was because we wanted to reach towards film for its artistic legitimacy. Now, over time, we of course started kind of correcting that. There's still a lot of cinematic elements to games because it's still a visual medium, but we stopped tried to stop looking to film as some sort of, god of artistic worth that video games must aspire to, because video games are art and we need to explore how they tell stories, not just trying to emulate how film tells stories. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with trying to combine multiple mediums in interesting ways. The action itself is not at all a problem. What we tried to get away from was a mindset, and I think that the tendency to criticize games that are like movies for trying to be movies is kind of an overreaction based on that. And actually, I think it's a very interesting idea. There hasn't really been anything quite like this. Maybe the closest would be the FMV games that we had a long time ago, like adventure games, but even that's not really the same thing. The live-action series actually changes a bit depending on your choices, and on a technical level, that's very impressive. Like, I'm not gonna say I don't know how they could have done it. I'm sure that there are plenty of ways that you can take, the scenes of an episode and make it so a game can splice them in where they need to be and stuff like that. Like, it's certainly doable, but it's pretty impressive nonetheless. So in that way, Quantum Break is actually pretty ambitious. So the question, of course, is, does it live up to that ambition? And not. So the basic story is that you play as a man named Jack Joyce, who comes back to the little town he grew up in to find that it has blossomed into a large, thriving city because of a corporation called Monarch. His old friend from this hometown has been working on a time machine, and he takes him in there to test it out, despite the fact that funding was recently cut on it because Jack's brother, William, who actually designed much of the base work for the time machine and was a consultant on its creation, was saying that there was something wrong, so they cut funding, all that stuff, but his friend Paul wants to try it out anyway, so they do, and it breaks time, essentially. Time is broken, and it's coming to an end of everything, and Jack Joyce, the character that you play, ends up in a unique situation where he can manipulate time. It actually goes further into it on a science fiction level, and the details are pretty neat, but I won't bother with it here. You can play the game if you're interested in that premise. Now, the live-action show, on the other hand, follows a number of side characters, mostly. Jack Joyce shows up on occasion, as does, the main antagonist and stuff like that, but generally speaking, it follows some other characters within the Monarch Corporation and stuff like that, so you can get kind of a more full view of what's going on, and those characters will factor into the story during the gameplay and stuff like that. The coolest thing, honestly, I think about the TV show is that it kind of helps sell the idea of Jack Joyce as something of a savior figure. We play so many characters in games who just, go out, destroy, kill all the guys, and I mean, it's a power fantasy, and there's no way that they could actually kill that many people, and we become kind of desensitized to it. But having us watch a show from the perspective of the other characters who are seeing this happening and don't actually know Jack Joyce, but are just hearing about all the stuff he's doing, makes it so that when watching the show, we really get a sense of him as this kind of mystical superhero figure. Despite the fact that, when we're playing as him, it just seems, like fairly normal shooting action, and that's a really cool thing for the show to accomplish. I like that. On the downside, the actual choices and the things that change in the show, kind of underwhelming. I very much am not a proponent of the idea that for choice to be important in games, it needs to change the story in major ways or anything like that. You can see like my video on Dragon Age Inquisition, or sorry, not Dragon Age Inquisition, Dragon Age 2, if you want to hear more about my thoughts on that. But point being, I don't think it's all that important, but when the whole point of the game is essentially that you get to see the effects of your choices in this live-action show, I kind of felt like there should have been a little more there. Generally speaking, there were basically just a couple minor differences, like in the beginning and ends, and maybe a couple little extra scenes that didn't really affect all that much if you found a certain collectible or something like that. The most frustrating thing, though, when it comes to player choice, didn't really have anything to do with with the live-action show. It was more just, there would be points where you're finding these collectibles, like reading emails from people in Monarch and stuff like that, and you'll read something that makes you realize, oh, okay, so this is going to happen, or this is how that works, or something like that. And then in a cutscene, like an hour later or something, the characters will come across this and have no idea how it works, or no idea what's happening. It kind of annoyed me that a game that tries to change some things based on what you choose and what you do didn't bother having the characters know things in the game that you, and thus they, have found and read about already. It's kind of a minor thing, but it's also kind of the thing I would think a game like this would think of, That said, the really interesting thing about the choices you made is that the big ones that really affected things were done at the end of each gameplay chapter before an episode of the miniseries, and it actually put you in the perspective of the antagonist to make this choice. He has kind of a future vision thing going on, so you can actually see the basic outline of the two choices ahead of him, and you choose what course of action he's going to take. And the whole idea of putting you in the perspective of the villain for the sake of making choices that change the way the story plays out is interesting. I'm not sure they used it to quite the potential that they could have, but it did definitely result in some very interesting conflicts for me between what I would want done and what was probably the smartest thing for this character that I didn't want to succeed. It was definitely an interesting twist on the whole formula. Now, mechanically speaking, the game is solid. It's essentially a fairly straightforward third-person shooter. It's kind of both its strength and weakness, I think, from a gameplay perspective. On one hand, it feels classic. Like, it feels like I could be playing this game on the PS2. It doesnn't have, it's not crowded with crazy leveling systems or, any kind of super, there aren't giant set pieces all the time. Like, as much as I love games like Uncharted or something, they're kind of just constantly moving from exciting set piece to exciting set piece. This game lets you spend a while just using the mechanics and shooting people in fairly straightforward situations. Like, it's simple, and in some cases I wish there were more to it, but it's also kind of nice. It's kind of refreshing in a classic sort of way. That said, when there were set pieces, oh man, they were crazy and just really interesting and awesome. It would generally revolve around time, like stuttering and moving back and forth, so there would be this crazy destruction going on, like a train crashing into a building or something, and as you're around and trying to navigate this or whatever, like flying bits of debris would be in midair and you'd have to like jump on them at the right times or something, or it was just really, really interesting. I'll talk more about the visual elements of time travel soon. The time powers in the game were, they're interesting. They serve to mix things up. You get to freeze people in place, dart around really quickly, even make a crazy like time explosion or something. It definitely served to mix up the game, and they give you enough different abilities that cool down fast enough that you can be fairly consistently using them, which is cool. It reminded me a little bit of Mass Effect, where it's not so much like, just use your normal attack until something cools down and then you can use it again, as it is that you can generally use things, but you need to kind of mix it up and use different things at different times if you want the cooldowns to work. And the balance worked really well, and when I really got into the groove of it, I really enjoyed it. It wasn't anything super special, but it did definitely lend an interesting rhythm. That's not really the word. An interesting pacing to the battle scenes that were just really interesting, and I enjoyed it. Speaking of pacing, though, that was sometimes a problem when it came to the interaction. It was, like, there would be times that you would spend a solid, like, 15, 20, maybe even 30 minutes walking around reading supplementary materials that you find around before you end up fighting guys for a while. Like, it seems like they could have spread those out a little bit more so it wasn't, you know, there were points where I got tired of reading things, and that's me. Like, I read every book I pick up in Skyrim, so it would have been nice for them to space things out a little more, I think, but that's kind of a minor pacing issue, and overall it's pretty good. But man, the highlight for me in terms of the gameplay segments, definitely the effects of time stopping. Essentially the idea is that as time is breaking, there are these stutters. Time will occasionally freeze, and sometimes even start, you know, just kind of messing around, going backwards and forwards, and just kind of freezing in this general area and quivering around in it. And man, that makes for some really interesting visuals. Like I talked about a few segments where there's some sort of crazy disaster happening, and you're seeing all of these things just kind of reverse themselves and then come back. And then when time is frozen, a lot of interesting things happen then, even in the battle scenes. There are, like, Jack can move around in frozen time because of his time powers, but there are other people who have technology that allows them to do it, and you have to fight them. And, like, it's really neat when you actually kill an enemy in this state, then they are then subject to time being frozen. So as soon as they die, they freeze in time. They'll just be, I mean, you know, little blood splatters still in the air, them just, you know, hanging there, and that's really interesting. And then whenever explosions happened in frozen time, it was crazy. It would, like, explode, and, you know, stuff would go flying all over the place and flying apart, and it would stay there for a bit, and then, you know, time would correct itself, because time is still frozen, and, you know, you can't be affecting things like that, and so it would just, like, go right back in. There were just a whole lot of really cool visual effects when it comes to time being frozen and moving around and stuff. They were just really good at atmosphere for these. Time being frozen was effectively, like, silent and kind of creepy. The best atmospheric moments of the game were definitely when time was stopping. Aside from, there are a couple little set-piece moments in the story that I could mention, but they'd be kind of spoilery. So just, yeah, atmosphere was pretty good, and that is a thing that Remedy's historically been good at, so I'm not surprised. Now, overall, the story is fine. The characters are actually really interesting, but they don't get developed as much as I would have liked, personally. They all have enough depth, and they're all interesting enough to move the story forward, for the most part. You know, William, the main character's brother, William, has, like, he's clearly kind of, he's incredibly intelligent, but he's also kind of troubled and he might have some kind of mental disorder or something, and he definitely, yeah, he was a very intriguing character for me. I enjoyed him a lot. The antagonist, who is played by the guy who plays Littlefinger in Game of Thrones, which was really weird. Yeah, he's a real interesting character. He's got some really interesting stuff going on. Beth Wilder, I can't say much without spoiling about her, but she's really interesting. They're interesting characters. The game doesn't give them all that much time to develop much as interesting characters. It just kind of, it makes them interesting enough to carry the story forward, and then just kind of doesn't bother developing them much after that, which, you know, it's serviceable, but it could have been a bit better, certainly. So far, I've actually gotten a bit more perspective on the characters from the novel than the game, but I'll talk more about that in the next video. Regardless, though, if you want a fun sci-fi story with, you know, a bunch of interesting twists and some fun time travel stuff, then this'll definitely do well for you on that end. It's got a whole lot of interesting ideas. The whole idea of the apocalypse, actually, is probably my favorite thing about the story. It's because it's not a matter of everything being destroyed or anything like that, like most, you know, end-of-the-world scenarios. It's just time is broken, and eventually it's gonna stop. Just completely stop. No one dies, nothing is destroyed or anything like that, but nothing moves anymore. Nothing happens. No one dies, but no one lives either. Everything's just frozen. It's such an interesting idea, and the way that it leads the villain to try and counteract it and stuff like that, it's also really interesting sci-fi stuff, and I enjoyed that a lot. Unfortunately, without spoiling things, of course, the ending is kind of lackluster. It does some genuinely good setup for the next game, but it also doesn't really close out a lot of things in this one, so it could have been better, but, I mean, you know, that's... Alan Wake did that too, now that I think about it, so that's, you know, kind of a minor complaint. I look forward to the next game, in any case. So yeah, overall, I don't think Quantum Break really lived up to the potential that it had. There was a bit more it could have done, some stuff it could have done better, some stuff it could have done more of, but it's still a really interesting idea, and I'm glad that I experienced it. It's kind of a cool story, the gameplay is nothing special, but it's solid. It all kind of comes together into a you know, a really nice atmospheric package that ends up being sandwiched between a TV show that's affected by your choices, which is just kind of unique and interesting. For the sake of an experiment, I definitely would say to give it a shot. I wouldn't expect it to be your new favorite game or anything like that, but it's unique and interesting. So like I said, in a little bit I'm going to be doing a video talking about the book based on it, Quantum Break Zero State, and we're going to talk a little bit about how the adaptation worked between the game and the book, and hopefully, you know, in doing so, bring up a little more conversation about adaptation in general as it relates to video games. So I look forward to seeing you then.